Huva paiva. Mina olen Joe. And unless you want me to count, that's all I can do. But I'm trying. So I want to talk, and I get the feeling that there's some really great stuff going on, but I don't quite understand. But I want to say ahead of time, I would be happy to talk to anybody after this, or you can email me, or we can get some coffee, because I think it's great to see people from all disciplines here, and teachers, and I saw a police officer and professors, and so I mean this is a great gathering of people, and I'm glad to be part of it. So let me go ahead. Oh, I have the thing. Let's see. Okay, so I'm a researcher, and I looked at this from a research perspective. I've also only been here 2 months. So what I'm trying to do is make some links directly between education and violent extremism. So the first thing is, what is violent extremism? And so I included a definition here. The idea, though, that I thought it would be real easy. All we have to do is make people more literate, right? I was in Morocco when there was back in the 80s, when there was a 50 to 70% illiteracy rate. And I thought, wow, if we just make people more literate, that'll take care of the problem. Or, if we just teach them how to accept other cultures, it would be that would take care of it. But in fact, you can't really draw a straight line between what we do in the classroom and reductions in violent extremism, or if you talk to somebody who's a violent extremism, it's not necessarily because they're illiterate. So I won't say that you shouldn't do those things. Help kids learn how to read. Help them be open-minded, to think critically. I will say that it's a complex situation, and a little bit more complex than just targeting a few things. So I want to talk a little bit, maybe not just about trying to help kids not be violent extremists, but who in our society, who in the Finnish society, are extreme, who has extreme behavior, law-violating behavior, and how do we help reduce the number and the repetitive nature of people that commit serious violent crimes or nonviolent crimes. So there's a couple things that I want to just highlight in the couple minutes that I have, realizing that I'm just barely going to touch the surface on a couple different things. So the first thing I want to talk about is the amazing information that we've gotten in the last couple of years of using brain imaging, and what we now know about youth development. And this is something that hasn't really taken hold in the United States. But this idea that young kids' brains are still developing, their ability to make good choices, impulse control, okay, goes beyond the teenage years. And their brains are still developing until about age 25. Is there anybody here that's younger than 25? No? Oh, well, yeah, so you're still developing. We forgive you for whatever you do today. So I was thinking about that, and, this new information we have from this neuroimaging. And then I start thinking, okay, I'm learning about Finland, but what is the Finnish approach then to this idea of culpability, this idea that younger people are perhaps less culpable because of their brain? And I think what you can see is that there's a bit of a disconnect in terms of policy and how youth are treated, and the age at which we now know that there's brain development is sort of concluded. Although hopefully mine's not concluded, because then I won't learn Finnish. So I started looking about extremism, right? And there was sort of ideological extremism and religious extremism. One thing that I also saw there was extremism related to poverty. And now, you know, Finland is one of the most equitable societies. And I wish the United States would take some of those ideas. But one thing that is important is to also recognize, if we're going to look forward into maybe there's not a huge incidence of violent extremism here, and it's not existing right now, but if you're looking to the future, I think we need to understand that in this society that those differences between rich and poor are increasing in Finland. And if you look at this study from just last year, the links, okay, between academic achievement, schools, and socioeconomic status of the students at those schools. All right? And so I think it's really important looking forward to say, is there one school who is disadvantaged? Because if it's true, well, it is true, those schools are going to generate youth who are disadvantaged. All right? So that's something I think which is important. And I'm not giving you a lot of answers, but perhaps in these couple of minutes, just a few things to think about. Now, a lot of the research and the focus that I do in the United States is youth in prison and youth that are in residential settings due to psychiatric problems. And so I'm very interested in the youth that are really separated from society, who feel separated, who are separated, and the way they act is separate from society. All right? And there are a group of youth in Finland who are disconnected and law violators. And the number of those has increased, and the number that have been placed outside of their home has increased over the years. And I started to look at why are they taken away? And in a lot of cases, you can see that it's because they've broken the law. So now the question is, we have these kids, they've broken the law, how do we deal with it? What's going to happen with them? And to really understand these kids on the fringes, we have to really kind of get an understanding of who they are. Because with an understanding of who they are, then you're able to try and set up programs that are going to address their unique needs. And one of the things that I found sort of interesting is that the youth in your society aren't that different than the ones who are incarcerated in the US. In terms of a couple different characteristics. Mental health, 89% of those youth in Finland placed outside of their home have a psychiatric disorder. In the United States, it's 70%. 76% have a conduct disorder. In the US, it's 50%. So we see some similarities between who in each society is marginalized and separated from everybody else and from their families. And then the other issue, when we go back to the idea of education, not only are these kids the ones that have mental disorders, psychiatric problems, but they're also the ones that have learning problems. 59% of those have a learning disability. And that's a huge issue if you're going to try and address how to help them to integrate or reintegrate into society. If you understand what they're dealing with and what needs to help them. So, these are a few things that I saw were similar across the United States and in Finland. But I wanted to highlight just a few other things where I couldn't find information in Finland. But if we assume that the patterns are similar, then we can also assume, perhaps, that youth that are separated from their families or put in residential care here have other mental disorders consistent with in the United States. So let's take a look at those and recognize those. All right, so in the US, about half of those kids have a substance use disorder. In the US, 90% of those kids involved in the juvenile justice system or your child welfare, more rehabilitative situation have experienced trauma. I couldn't find any research on, for example, the implementation of trauma-informed care, trauma interventions for these youth. All right? I'm talking about in Finland. And so I think it's important that we start to take a look at that. 30% and 12% respectively have experienced physical or sexual abuse. And if you look at in the United States the number of girls who are involved with law-violating behavior, the incidence of sexual abuse goes way up to somewhere between 50 and 70%. And then also just the notion that these kids are at high risk for suicide. Not only are they at high risk for suicide, but the problem about being taken out of your home and being placed in a setting is that you're more likely to be successful at suicide. All right? You think about a kid in their home, takes a bottle of ibuprofen, whatever, the chances of death are fairly small. You think about a kid who's placed in a facility where it's more likely that they don't have access to anything except something to hang themselves. So the chances of somebody in those settings actually being successful committing suicide are much higher. Just a couple other really depressing things, and you all are going to want to go to the pub after you hear me talk because everything's depressing. ADHD, anxiety disorder, and depression, okay? And so I think it's just important to take a consideration. If we're talking about marginalized youth, who are we talking about? What are their characteristics? And if you're going to try and prevent them from being extreme or getting sucked up in extreme causes, how do you help them? How do you help them proactively if you know that they're the ones at risk for this? So I tried to look for information on youth that were taken out of the home in Finland. There's not really any information, okay? And there might be some great things going on. I have no idea. All I can do is figure out what it is that I see and what I read. And maybe there's some things written in Finnish. But the question is, when they're taken out, what happens to them? All right? In terms of school, going back to school, are they given the same curriculum? Do they have access? And if you say yes, is there any proof of that? In terms of teachers, a lot of times you get youth that are isolated in small places outside of the home, and there's very few teachers. And so what you might have is one teacher who has to teach several things. And if you have a teenager, is it possible for the same teacher to teach physics and literature, for example? And that's one big problem in the US, is that you don't have enough teachers with enough content expertise to actually give those kids the education that they need. What effective evidence-based interventions are used with those kids? Again, I'm not aware of any information. And I think that's the first step. There are ideas for what's effective instruction. And are those being applied? There's information on effective instruction for kids with learning disabilities, which we said was 59% of these youth. All right? 5 minutes on. So, and then what about teacher professional development? And one of the big things is when you have youth that are separated, are they being actually provided a different level of services by people that are more qualified, all right? And in the US, I did a study and found out that actually that the teachers in all of these settings are less qualified, and so are the principals, nationally, all right? And that's a problem, and then what are they doing? Another key thing is what happens once they're excluded. How do they get back into society? All right? And that transition is very hard. And so the question is, what is provided to them while they're separated and after to help them to reintegrate society so that they don't further their extreme behavior? I've done a couple studies in the United States in terms of mental health. And these are national studies in the US, and kids aren't screened or evaluated for mental health disorders. They aren't provided mental health interventions. And the people that are supposed to be helping them are not provided professional development in mental health. And that includes not just teachers, but what other caregivers exist. As an example, okay, about 8.5% of youth in Finland have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. No Finnish studies have been conducted on school-based interventions for kids with ADHD. And that's not my statement, that's from the authors at the bottom. And there's no training for people that want to be teachers in this. So here's another way that if there's research, if there's information, and then there's training for people, they're going to help youth who don't end up needing the more serious, deep-end services. So how well is Finland doing with these youth? And this is a bit problematic. 90% of incarcerated youth below 18 return to prison within 3 years in Finland. US, you can see the recidivism rate. 66% of all residential school graduates had at least one criminal conviction as an adult. So this notion of how are we assisting them moving from exclusion and isolation back to the community the answer is it's not happening. It's not happening effectively. And then the risk of violent crimes of those that had been in residential settings is 18 times greater than others. And there's an admitted issue from the National Institute of Health and Welfare that there is a need for follow-up for these youth. All right? And so again, if you want to talk about extremism and preventing reoccurrence and recidivism, then it requires support in these areas. There's one last thing that I want to mention, and that is this notion of those youth, 8% of youth. These are not the ones that are taken out of school, but are in a school, but are taught separately, all right? And when you take a look at those, most of the time, they're taught there. The reason is other reasons, okay? You're placed separate class for other reasons. Well, what are other reasons? And is this just a dumping ground where we put all those kids that are annoying, all those kids that are problematic? And then again, I couldn't find any research. When these kids are placed in these separate classrooms, 8% of youth in Finland, what happens to them? All right? We may know anecdotally, but what happens? What do we know from a research perspective, what really happens? Are they getting extra support behaviorally? What is it? Are they getting extra help academically? What is it? So a lot of this, and I think I probably have about 5 seconds, but I brought up probably more problems than issues, but I think going forward, these are things that need to be part of the conversation if you want to talk about extremism and how do we address it proactively And for those kids that are there, how do we help them so that they reintegrate back into society? And there we go. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Joseph, for your interesting insights. Thank you.